floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so I thought I'd take advantage of the fact that this is a workshop and that I'm very early in the workshop of trying something a little different. I should say thank you so much for the invite. So some of you may have seen some of these slides before, but the difference between now and then is that, oh, are we working? Oh, yeah, okay.
Okay.
The difference between when you may have seen some of these slides now is I'm not going to try to impress you. So actually what this talk is kind of, so I'm going to be talking about a paper that just came out with Kevin Reuter that's been in preprint for a while, but if you've read the preprint, it's changed a lot. But I want to talk about how this kind of happened, where I went from, I think, like a really cool idea, which is doing experimental implementation, and then less than stellar execution. And so I used this opportunity of the workshop to kind of reflect in a way I hadn't before on why I think the execution didn't quite work in the way I wanted it to, and what it says about the state of the field and the state of like the theory of implementation. So so the plan then is to reflect on why this paper did not live up to our dreams. Okay, that font is very different. Sure, all right. What went wrong? And kind of go about what went wrong, but more specifically, what bits of theory we're missing. And I think, yeah, well, you'll see what I mean by that. Because I want to, like, in this paper, we tried to actually revise people's concepts in an experimental setting. And I want to kind of use it to examine aspects of implementation that we might not think about in the abstract. So for, most of the talk of this is very, very abstract. Or even when it's not abstract, it's kind of trying to draw analogies from other areas that are kind of more concrete. And I want to explore what I can learn as a post-mortem from this project about kind of implementation, because we tried to do it. And kind of for you guys, the idea is to highlight fruitful directions for research. So I've personalized this a bit, and so we'll see how successfully I personalize this. But so far, I almost changed one slide because of the Q&A, so I think it's going well. So what was the project's motivation? Way back when I started working on this, it was the unseriousness that philosophers approach implementation. Like the sort of philosophers who push for like sort of conceptual change. And so I first started thinking about this, I was Kevin Sharp's student during my PhD, and thinking about like, he's kind of like threw it out there and said, that's enough. And there are like tons of examples I could pick about this, but I'm going to pick on my co-author. Conspirator, he has not seen this talk, by the way, so don't send any notes to him. So they, in Napolitano and Reuter, have this great paper where they examine, from the point of view of experimental philosophy, the term conspiracy theory. And in the conspiracy theory literature, the standard view is that conspiracy theory is a descriptive term. It's this neutral term to describe theories that are conspiracies. So any sort of theory that invokes a conspiracy as part of the explanation on the standard account is a conspiracy theory. And they did some XFI and found, I think pretty convincingly, but also this, I think if you like listen to your ear, this is obvious, which is it's a negative evaluative term. It's what Josh Habdub calls epistemic slur. You only use it when you think the person you're talking to is like being irrational. The problem with this is that then there's no neutral counterpart to this. There's no neutral term in English for any theory that invokes conspiracies as an explanation. There's no way to kind of like talk about, at the time, the theory that like President Richard Nixon like covered up the fact that he was spying on his political rivals. If you call that a conspiracy theory, you're already kind of giving it a bad label. There's no neutral term here. So they go from this observation to this problem. So their solution is they want to introduce conspiratorial explanation as a neutral counterpart. So great, now we can talk about neutrally. And their attempt to spread it is an argument in their academic paper. It's 3 paragraphs in their Kentis. And I think this is pretty standard fare for the literature as it is. Like I just pick on them because it fits really well with my next example. But I can pick, probably at this point dozens of papers that do something like this, where they're like, there's this problem, it has this big result, let's fix it, and then it stops. So like, let's fix it, here's my published paper. So I want to talk about another example that's structurally very similar. Anyone in here Swedish? I don't think so. So SNIPA is this interesting example out of Sweden, where in the 1990s, there were these kind of public discussions in Sweden about how the Swedish as a language has a widely accepted kid-friendly word for male genitals, like something that they can like talk to kids about, snopp, but not for females. And this is a very common problem in European languages. So for example, like English has this feature where like maybe you can, for boys, you can talk about their willy, and there's not really a counterpart for girls. And so this hurts young females. So we've got kind of the same thing we have before. There's this hermeneutic gap. I think like you could probably argue they're both hermeneutic and justice in the Fricker sense, depending on how you want to cash out injustice. But this hurts young females. There's this hermeneutic gap. Young females can't talk about their bodies in the same way. Their caretakers can't talk about their bodies in the same way. This has like negative consequences on, this hermeneutic gap has negative consequences on young females. So the solution was to introduce SNIPA as a counterpart to SNOP. It's meant to be kind of this playful play on SNIPA, on the pre-existing word SNOP. Again, so far we're the same, it's all the same, but then their propagation efforts look very different. So the RFSU, which is this sex ed, sexual education like nonprofit, led this public health campaign. And I want to look at some examples of what this public health campaign looked like. So here's a very early book. This is a book for little girls called The Girls' Little Ones, and it's like a poem, and one of the verses is, so many names for the girl's little one, that is really something. Most of them start with an M, but we think SNIPA is the best. So notice here that there's kind of two arguments happening. One is they're kind of to the parents, they're saying, hey look, this is the best way to talk about it, but also to the girls who are being given this, like this is what you should call it. Here's an art project by a college student. She put around these balloons that said, basically it's called SNIPA. There's this really awesome, very catchy music video that I can show people during the break if they're curious. And there's also a series of books where we got SNIPA on the left and SNOP on the right, kind of hanging out, having a good time. Not just once, but actually 4 times. And like actually, yeah, they fight dragons. They have a great time together. So messed up font. I should have put this in PDF. But we're really seeing 2 approaches to implementation here, where we've got like kind of this very serious, very target-facing, attempt to propagate, where they're actually writing books to try to teach these terms, and 3 paragraphs in their canvas. So I was thinking at the time, what would it look like for conceptual engineer philosophers to approach propagation with the same seriousness? What would it look like for us to actually kind of do this? And because at the time I was at an XFI group, in the back of my mind, what would the science of implication? That's kind of how I interpreted this with seriousness. Is how would we actually do the research to figure out, not only can this spread, but would the certain way of wording it spread in the way we want it to? How would people interpret it? Would it have the consequences we want? So what would the science of implementation look like? So then I turned to try to do X implementation, experimental implementation. And my very first attempt of it is I ran a study where I gave people, I gave people a couple of different interventions. And then at the end of the study, I asked, all right, so what do you think? Am I right? Would you use it this way? And I didn't believe my results. Anyone who's done empirical data, when you don't believe your own results, you're in a bad way. And there are really 2 challenges here, which is, the first is survey pragmatics. And so it's just like normal kind of pragmatic stuff. When someone's taking a study you've done, from their point of view, they're having a conversation with you, the experimenter. They might not know anything about you. They might have very false beliefs about you. But from their point of view, they're having a conversation where they're trying to figure out what it is you're trying to figure out, what it is you're asking, what it is you're trying to do. They might make beliefs about sort of what your actual hypothesis is as opposed to your stated hypothesis, and this will affect the results. And so this kind of comes in two flavors, why just giving someone kind of a, hey, look, here's how to change your concept, and then asking them, hey, have you changed your concept? There are two reasons why survey pragmatics kind of gets in the way of this. One is, if they're trying to be helpful, they're going to answer the way they think you want. So if I was like giving I went out and I said, hey, look, here's Sally Hesslinger's concept of a woman, they're necessarily objectified and stuff like this. What do you think? If they're trying to be helpful, they're going to say, yeah, cool, thumbs up, I agree with this. Not because they actually think this, not because they're actually going to change their mind, but from their point of view, that's what I'm looking for. And so they're going to answer that way. The other problem is kind of more in like the Gricean sense of pragmatics, or maybe more of a Ludlowian sense of pragmatics, where in the conversation of the study, there's this worry that like we would kind of develop a micro-language. So again, if I'm using woman in this specific sense, and I'm like in sort of my intervention to try to convince people, hey, here's how you should use the concept, here's how you should use the word. From their point of view, when they then see like a question, so what is a woman, they might take that to be in the micro-language of the study. Or sort of, if you don't like the Ludlowian view, kind of the conversation, there's like the conventional, the pragmatic kind of milieu of the study. But there's also this other problem with just like giving people an intervention and stopping and asking like, what do you think? Which is there's like this problem with short-term memory versus long-term change. So conceptual engineers talk as if they want these like big structural differences. They don't want to change what you do now in this conversation, and a couple do, but they're more kind of interested in what do you do a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. And from a cognitive point of view, these are very, very, very different processes based on like what you can hold in your head for a couple minutes versus what kind of comes to, what do you, like what inferences, what thoughts do you have a year down the line, 2 days down the line, even like half an hour down the line when you're doing something else. And so the solution to this, and this is the one part of the paper I stand behind, we can talk about which of the rest I stand behind, but this is the one thing I do stand behind, is we can work around this by time lagging the design, meaning we ask them, in our case we did it 2 to 3 days, between 2 and 3 days later. So we gave them the intervention and asked them 2 to 3 days later, hey, to express their conceptual content. So this gets around the problem of the short-term thing. We're checking whether the content's stuck. We also masked it, so we removed the salience of the intended change and survey pragmatic. So we gave them the intervention, and then 2 hours later, we posted on Prolific, and then 2 hours later, we came back under a different account, under a different researcher name, a different kind of looking at Qualtrics, and we happened to slip in right in the middle of it the question we were looking for to see if they were giving us to measure what their conceptual content was.
Yeah. To see if there's anyone in the waiting room.
Nope.
Okay.
And I think a lot of the problems came down to, like, I'm a method stork. That's kind of why I'm now in a psychology department, is I find these questions, like these methodological puzzles, really interesting. So I really designed the initial study as a methodological proof of concept. And so I didn't really care about like what concepts were, or what even like necessarily what concepts we used. I didn't have like a stake in the matter for particular concepts or particular views of concepts, which I think got us into trouble when it came to reviewers, but and writing the paper. But this is kind of the main innovation we were trying to do. So here's how it actually went. So we chose 2 concepts after a lot of discussion. This took us like months of discussion to settle on concepts we were happy with. And I'll talk a bit later on, sort of from an ethical and pragmatic point of view, why we chose these, because I think it's important to like understanding where the discipline's at. We chose planet and dinosaur. And planet we all know the example of. There were 9 planets, now there are 8. I thought it wouldn't work, but to our surprise, like 60% of people on Prolific call Pluto a planet, if you ask them. All right, we can work with that. We also used dinosaur, which is less well known, but in biology, the way cladistic categorizations work is they're cladistic, so they're kind of based on the common ancestor. So everything with the common ancestor is under that category. So because birds happen to have survived as a, survived, their ancestors to birds were dinosaurs. Because of that, they are dinosaurs. And this is like a fairly recent discovery. So we were trying to shift people's concept from like the Jurassic Park view of concepts to this more scientific view of concepts. So this is a screen capture from Wikipedia article where the dinosaur is like this it's a real exercise to read the dinosaur article on Wikipedia because their sentence is like this: an adult bee hummingbird, the smallest known dinosaur. And so we were trying to say, can we get people to move kind of from the left to the right? And we wrote these interventions, and these interventions were designed to be mostly transparent. So I wrote them and I really copied them based on what you would see in like a popular science article, something like Scientific American or the BBC. In fact, we quoted a fair bit of like things from Scientific American and BBC. We didn't put them in terms of like, we are changing your concepts, because normal people don't talk like that. We just put them kind of very object level. So planets are this. So in this, here we have this is like the first page of one of the interventions where we said, here's what a planet is, it must orbit a star, it must be big enough, have enough gravity to be spherical, and it must be big enough that there's its orbit of debris. And then we also said, hey, and here's some like fancy experts who also said this and kind of explained why. And we also threw in some pictures. So this picture was meant to kind of illustrate that Pluto really has much more to do with these trans-Neptunian objects than they do the planets. So we wrote two of these for dinosaur and two of these for planet. One of them was about 2 minutes long and only text, took him about 2 minutes to read. One of them was 3 minutes, took him about 3 minutes to read, and all pictures. And so this was meant to be mostly transparent and fairly short. And then we included our measures. And again, we didn't really have a view of concepts in mind. And I actually want to pick most of your brains on, or a lot of you, I want to pick your brains on how you think like an inferentialist measure would work, for example. But we figured, let's do as many, let's kind of capture as many people as we can. So we took categorization. This is a classic thing that concepts do, is they help us categorize the world. So this was we gave them like a multiple choice test as a measure at the second point, and we tested whether or not they picked Pluto as one of the planets. We had a completion test, which Eugen Fischer calls a single sentence priming task, where you ask people to complete a sentence such that it's true. So we say Pluto is, and then we see what they say, and then we rated them based on whether they said some planet or something equivalent to it. And then we had a semantic feature production task, which is also called feature listing tasks, which is a real workhorse of the kind of stereotype prototype corner of Psych and Cog-Sci, where we ask people to list 3 things that came in mind, or 3 terms that come in mind when you think about Pluto. And then for dinosaur, the test was whether or not they selected a seagull as a dinosaur, and then like dinosaurs are, and dinosaurs are, and 3 things that come in mind with dinosaur. And then we rated, did they say extinct? And we were looking then for a difference between the test group, which had seen the intervention 2 to 3 days earlier, 2 hours to 3 days earlier, compared to a control group that we recruited at the same time, who hadn't seen any intervention. So that was the design. We split everyone up into either the dinosaur group or planet group. We gave our test group then one of 2 intervention stimuli. We weighted, and then we collected, then on the other account we collected all of the measures. So every participant answered one of those 3 measures and then also we had a control group do it, so we could compare them against control. And this is like roughly what we found. Again, I'm not going to settle too much on this. I want to talk about sort of lessons as opposed to the findings here. But essentially what we found is that planet was very sort of, we managed to change on these measures people's use of planet pretty successfully. So the top of the axis is the percentage of expert and consistent responses. So in planet this would be them saying Pluto's a planet. For dinosaur, it'd be saying dinosaurs extinct or some synonym. And then gray is the control, green is the test, and then those are the three measures. The categorization measure is the one on the left, where the multiple choice test, for both planet and dinosaur, that looked very easy. So we both saw like a 50% difference between the control and the test group, which means that like those seem to be pretty plastic and something you can change pretty quickly, but maybe not for these kind of more association-based tests, these food response tests, where we saw these changes with planet but not dinosaur. So that's kind of, I just wanted to introduce this to get it on the table. I want to have a clock so I knew how I was doing on time.
So you spoke
All right, oh, I'm going quick. All right, I'll slow down a bit. Great, so I want to talk about then for the rest of this, lessons learned, which I'm going to talk about why and how this fell short, or things I wish I'd done better. And I don't think anyone's in here is an experimental philosopher. I also have some opinions about the design, but I think that given the audience only interesting to me. But I sat down and I stuck them into like three categories. Theoretical lessons, which are what things important to implementation have we kind of collectively have we not figured out, and how's theory holding back our understanding of implementation. Ethical lessons, what was learned about the ethics of implementation, what sort of ethical questions and ethical problems I think this raised in my head. And pragmatic lessons, what was learned about implementation's chances for success. It's very practical, down-to-earth stuff. So let's start with theoretical lesson one. I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anyone. The conceptual content literature is a theoretical mess. The concept literature is a mess. Like anyone who's tried to work with concepts, anyone who's tried to write a paper using concepts in a general way will have, I think, experienced how much of a nightmare it is to like use concepts in a way that's inclusive for everyone. And we had picked the measures we did because they were chosen as inclusive and literature supported. Well, inclusive to internalists because XY is internalist inherently. But I think this turned out to be the most, when it went to reviewers, this turned out to be the most contentious. The most contentious point was whether or not it measured conceptual content, and not the way I expected. I think, so we presented this Kevin presented this at Hong Kong with Max Storch and Herman, which are like the most externalist, not the most externalists. I like know a few, I think Derek Ball is the most externalists, but they're like, you know, getting there. And they were, it was very clear that they did, I shouldn't say this, it's being recorded, but one might wonder whether they had a concept of internalist concepts, because there was a lot of hemming and hawing about, wait, so you're telling me that if what comes to mind when I think of dinosaur changes, then I've changed my concept? They really didn't get that. They really had trouble kind of grasping that aspect of this. But I think more specifically is that there was, but like putting that aside, putting this issue of like different accounts of concepts aside, like metaphysical accounts, there was like this, there's this clear that there's this problem with, we disagree on what concept change looks like in practice. Even like when you like come down to like just internalists, or even just internalists of a certain type, there just isn't clarity about how these things cash out in behavior. So one of our reviewers said, the study does not test how conceptual content changes, but how scientific information affects judgments. And I was a bit taken back for this, because I'm like, well, we took these measures from like we took these measures from other people. I would think that this changes, but I really think that there needs to be more translation work here. So I'll jump to symptom 2. I think that there's an overly abstract discussion of concepts in the literature. My pragmatism is really coming out here. I'm realizing this now. I think there's an overly abstract discussion of concepts in the literature where it's really nice to look at concepts and say, well, they're the constituents of thought. Great. And so like, because of the constituents of thought, we're going to change how we act, we're going to change how we talk, we're going to change all these things if our constituents of thought change. Great. But there's so many ways of kind of breaking that down and like precifying that to something that's like practical. That it's sort of like the literature's a mess. And so there really needs to be more, I think there's this common lacuna in the literature, which is what would conceptual change behaviorally look like? We don't know what we're aiming for. Like people who are studying concepts, there's not a clear thing that they're aiming for. What would it look like for your view to succeed? If I like went up to someone and I wanted to figure out, have I implemented my concept here? What would I do? And I think there needs to be more work on that, especially in non-standard views of concepts. And this is one of the reasons I really like Eugen Fischer's paper, 2020 paper, Conceptual Control, is he's done the translation work here, but not many other people have. The other problem is XFI is tacitly invariantist about concepts. There is very much space for an XFI critical paper, if anyone likes this sort of literature, where XFI kind of tacitly assumes that there's like this core content. Every concept has like this core content that doesn't change, that's just kind of there and hangs out, and you get at it by asking people thought experiments or like asking them to make getting at their linguistic intuitions. Not so much popular outside of XFI as you get into like, especially not a very popular view in like cognitive linguistics. So I think there's also kind of, there's this, XFI's picked up some of the bad habits of analytic philosophy, and I think there's space to criticize it there. And since we were both experimental philosophers, we just kind of assumed, oh yeah, there's a core conceptual content, where it's not clear that that's actually the case once you're doing science. All right, lesson number 2, polysemy is a huge theoretical lacuna for conceptual engineering. I'm so glad that there's a polysemy talk on here. I'm going to talk briefly, I'm sure you're going to do a much better job than I will, but I'm going to talk briefly why I think that this is a problem for conceptual engineering. Polysemy, of course, means that like when terms have like multiple related senses. From our point of view, it found us really hard. We were looking for concepts that we could kind of ethically throw our weight behind. We picked Dinosaur and Planet because we thought these were concepts that we could endorse. These are concepts with a clear, correct content, and this clear, correct content's backed up by like both scientific consensus and like something natural and kindy. But when we were searching around for these, when we were searching around for concepts that like we could say, hey, where we could like kind of with like a clear conscience try to get people to use the term this way or use the concept this way. When we were taking polysemy seriously, it was really, really hard to find that. For example, are tomatoes fruit? Well, it kind of looks like the dinosaur example and the planet example, where we have this common use that tomatoes are vegetables, and we have the scientific use that tomatoes are fruit. But I think to my ears, these are very much two distinct senses of fruit. There's like the sense of fruit, there's this botanical scientific sense of fruit, and there's the sense I use when I like go to get a smoothie. I'd be kind of upset if I ordered a fruit smoothie and there's a tomato in it, because that's not the term I'm using, but maybe if I was in like the biology room, I would say, yeah, tomatoes are fruit. So some of them were structured this way, some of them were structured like, are palm trees grass? And the problem with here is that there are multiple competing definitions of grass floating around, where some people use grass this way, some people use grass this way. It's a very similar case with species. There's a couple of different ways of delineating this floating around. And so on some definitions, trees are grass, and some definitions they aren't. From the externalist point of view, what this looks like for them is that I'm clearly othering them, when they need to answer when are there two concepts and when are there different conceptions. So it's like when are you dealing with like fruit and fruit, two concepts or two meanings or two reference covered under the same lexical item, and when are there just different conceptions that some people, there's actually one and there's two people about this. there's actually just one, and people are just wrong, or like I'm half wrong about what fruit is, I guess, is what they say here. The internalist picture, though, which I'm gonna I think focus a bit more on, is new mental content is generally additive, not substitutive. Old content does not die, people die. And there hasn't been enough kind of dealing with this fact. So from a cognitive point of view, what happens when, say, I pick up new information about planet is the old use of planet's still in there. There's still a part of me that wants to use planet in the way that includes Pluto. There's an old part of me that still wants to, there's an old part of me that still wants to use planet to describe Pluto, but there's like a louder part of me that doesn't. But like it's still there, and I can still kind of swap between the two. And so I want to kind of illustrate this with an example. So this is a true example. This is really how it goes for me. I know that birds are a type of dinosaur. I can deploy the updated content. I saw dinosaurs on my way to work today. Dinosaurs and sometimes I go to the zoo and see dinosaurs and mammals. Like, I can do this. But I don't picture birds when I hear dinosaur. I would say if you caught me unaware and asked if dinosaurs are extinct, it's a 50-50 shot, whether I'd say yes or no. And if I wanted to see dinosaurs for my birthday, I'd be upset if we went to an aviary. I would want to go to a natural history museum and see fossils. So I'm clear. So this like non-technical use of dinosaur in the Jurassic Park sense is very much there, very much alive in my head, and I can modulate between the two. In a sense, birds are dinosaurs. In a sense, they're not. That feels right to me. So is my concept of dinosaur revised? Has my concept changed? Or is it revised? Let's stick to revised. Is it revised for the purposes of conceptual engineering? I don't know. What if the sense dominance was flipped? What if I used dinosaur most of the time to talk about things that included birds, but I could swap and say, well, I could say like, well, in the normal folk sense, dinosaurs are extinct. What if that was going on? So I was more likely to, so I did picture birds when I said dinosaur, and I'd use it to mean birds, or be inclusive of birds. But there was still that old sense still floating around in my head that would sometimes pop out. What was my concept revised then? Or what if I used technically to modulate? What if I always said, well, like, technically birds are dinosaurs, but like really birds aren't dinosaurs? Is my concept revised then? Or what if I reliably modulate based on context? So every time I'm in a philosophy class setting, I use dinosaur in the bird inclusive sense, and then every time I'm out on the street, I use dinosaur in the bird exclusive sense. Has it been revised then? I don't know. And this is a problem for externalists too. I think Sturkin's paper, this is not what she's trying to do in the paper, but I think she's the most clear-headed, one of the most clear-headed people about this. Where like, are there two distinct meanings or concepts of dinosaur? Here is, I think, a question that hasn't been addressed enough. So this is why I think there's this big lacuna with polysemy. Theoretical lesson number 3, has Planet actually been revised? I loved using Planet, and still do use Planet, as an example of like actual successful conceptual engineering, because it's got all the hallmarks where they actually like consciously got together, decided as a group, this is what we want Planet to be. There was a big implementation project in the form of like media campaigns. Like the IAU actually put out press releases. This was very much a conscious thing on their part. But in our study, 40 to 80%, depending on our measure, attributed planethood to Pluto in the control group. So more than half of people described Pluto as a planet, or picked Pluto as an example of a planet. And I think we're in a position where the only people who will definitely say on this data that planet has actually been revised are Bergians who take meaning to be determined by experts. There's that whole question of whether this is actually what Berge thinks, and Derek Ball's metalinguistic ethics paper has a great discussion of this. But like, they're going to say the experts changed the view, so everyone's just catching up. But The only other group that will, I think, on this view, that will unambiguously say that Pluto is not a planet are like Kripke or Putnam flavored natural kind externalists who are going to say that the concept didn't change in the first place. And so it's really only Burgians, I think, who can confidently say planet has been revised. The IAU successfully revised planet. And the lesson from this, the further lesson is, I think internalists need to be comfortable talking about partial success at the level of the community. So in this case, with planet, community, but also going back to dinosaur at the level of the individual. I think it's been there's partial success if you want to think of dinosaur as a conceptual engineering project. There's partial success in me. And so yeah, that's kind of, I think this needs to be worked out more. Let's move on to ethical lessons. Implementation's intent is complicated. So Eva's great paper talks about paternalistic conceptual engineering, which aims at the target's epistemic good. And for us, I don't know that we necessarily aimed at the target's epistemic good. So I'm not sure how her view applies to us. For example, so for us, we were interested in improving the epistemic standing of the people we were intervening on, but that was merely a necessary condition. That wasn't the aim of our project. We wanted to pick concepts that we were reasonably clear it would be ethical to try to get people to change how they talked. But our real aim was we wanted to see, as I said at the start, would this actually work? Can this method can we actually study this? What can, an intervention we were asking ourselves, can an intervention this short change this? Change how people talk? And given in America it's called publish or perish, in the UK it's called neoliberal academia, I don't know what it's called in Europe, but given we're in that society, part of us was also saying, I want to produce a paper. And so I think those were our aims, and the question of whether we were aiming at the epistemic good was really merely something that we wanted to make sure to do, but was in no sense the purpose of what we were doing. A similar, similar remarks for Shield's work on conceptual domination. Here the conceptual domination involves pushing for uptake because the content serves one interest, when those interests are irrelevant or hurt inquiry. And there's a sense in which the content we were pushing for uptake was irrelevant to us. There was a sense in which it wasn't irrelevant to us because we cared about it, we wanted to do the right thing, but there was a sense in which it was irrelevant to us because it was merely a vehicle to test what we wanted to test. Shields also talks about a marker of conceptual domination is that they aim to bring about uptake by exploiting institutions and institutional authority, and I just wanted to flag this is fulfilled by any experimental setting. Any experimental setting involves a power mismatch, an imbalance between the experimenter and the experimentee, where the experimenter is relying on their institutional power, their institutional finance to recruit participants, in our case, get access to the prolific platform and prolific recruitment, but also in the classroom, if you're doing studies in the classroom, have people in the classroom to take it. And the people being experimented on are at the victim because, especially on the online platforms, they're essentially gig workers, where the experimenter is holding financial reimbursement over the person being experimented on. So, so this is, I think, a very icky part of the way psychological research is being done these days, but it's worth kind of flagging that any sort of research starts to look a bit like domination on the Shield's view for this reason. Ethical lesson number 2, implementation need not be propaganda. So I was going to say, I wasn't very confident about this first point, but there's a tension in the literature between process and outcome, between doing it the right way and getting the best results. And then in the Q&A, there was tension between doing it the right way and getting the best results. And I think the people who kind of push towards get the best results tend to. This is mostly in person. If anyone knows of this in text, I'd be curious to see it. But the people that get the best results are like, well, just do whatever it needs to take to get it done. So I had a recent referee on a different paper where I was talking about kind of teaching people concepts, and I was talking about how like you need to be careful not to mislead people about what the content is. The referee said, well, you should discuss cases where you want to strategically mislead concepts, where you purposely be, where you purposely want to be a bit dishonest about what you're doing. And I think this study kind of shows, if you buy into its findings, that implementation looks to be achievable with explicit, transparent interventions. There's a question of what the best explicit, transparent interventions are, but we really aim to do nothing more than what they would read if they read like an edutainment article. That's really all we were giving participants. And so there doesn't need to be this like underhanded propagandistic element to it. But maybe it does need to be propaganda. So our design goal was to choose concepts with clear expert consensus. But that was one of our design goals. That was kind of one of our necessary conditions, because we wanted to say, we weren't going out on a limb. There was backing for this. This is very few and far between, especially when polygamy is taken seriously. So for example, we talked about doing the sex-gender distinction. But there are the essentialists, there are the anti-essentialists, there are the anti-essentialists. And so even like within philosophy, even though the weight is kind of towards endorsing the sex-gender distinction, there's still scholarship coming out against it. And over and over and over, we just could, and I think like this is true of like anything anyone in this room or online would want to implement. Is if you want to implement something, there's not going to be expert consensus here. There are going to be people who disagree with you. And so you might have to go out kind of on a limb. And it might be necessary to go out on a limb and do something that is like inherently political in this aspect. And to show you how tricky this is, I thought Planet had a clear expert consensus. It does not. I've realized in the intervening time, it does not. There's a, So there are a number of prominent experts who've come out against the IAU definition because it is a hot mess. It is horrid if you start picking into it and digging out the details. It does not say what you think it says. So first off, it explicitly only applies to this solar system. It only says a planet, if something's a planet if it orbits around the sun, not around a star, a sun. So I guess there are only 8 planets, full stop. Cleared the neighborhood around its orbit and hydrostatic equilibrium are both vague predicates. And so there's a lot of disagreement about how to define these. And worse is there's an extent. So we all know about the intentional definition. It's clear, they gave these 3 criteria. In a footnote, they also give an extensional definition where they say the 8 planets are, and then list them. The problem is, the intentional extensional definitions are inconsistent because, I cut it, Mercury is not in hydrostatic equilibrium. So the intentional definitions don't actually apply accurately to the 8 planets. So there's not clear expert consensus for this. So I think, so the point with this slide was to say, if I'm reminding myself, thanks Elizabeth for making it acceptable to go full workshop here. The point of this is to say I think any sort of implementation, unless it's a very, very, very special kind, is going to have to necessarily push the implementer's agenda in some way. I think that's, from a purely sort of social point of view, unavoidable. All right, let's wrap up with some pragmatic lessons. I don't think philosophers have the social cachet to pull off implementation. So let's talk about, from our point of view as experimenters, we talked about, an early version we talked about is like, well, let's introduce new terms. I was working on a project at the time where I had a bunch of pseudo words with novel concepts. Both the term was new and the concept was new. And we thought, well, why don't we try to get people to adopt those? Well, there's a coordination problem here, which is the people we were talking to needed to believe that the term will be understood by people. So will be understood with the people they're talking to. So if I say, so one of the pseudo words was like a foras. If I was like, hey, a foras is this, in any sort of setting except for one where I looked, it was very clear that I knew what I was talking about, so not an experimental setting. Anyone taking that concept, no one would take that term going forward unless it was like obscenely useful, because from their point of view, if I told them that, hey, there's this word for us, they've never heard it before, so why on earth would they use it with someone else? Because then they'll just have to explain it to someone else. So there's this coordination problem where like we need to convince people to adopt our language. But the other is that new terms require groundwork. So going back to my opening example of SNIFA, there were years and years of public discussion about introducing a term that had these features. This didn't come out of nowhere. This came out of like the ground was softened up for the term to be introduced. And if we think about other examples like this, where in English we can pick out examples that have come out of academia to become kind of like general folk words, like social distancing, microaggression, cultural appropriation, and large language models. These are all terms that were sitting around in academic literature for decades. So social distancing entered the epidemiology vocabulary in 2004. Large language models was popped in the late 2000s. These were all words that were floating around for a long time. And then in the case of social distancing and large language models, suddenly there's a really, really obvious need for it. But with some like microaggression and cultural appropriation, there was kind of like this steady introduction of post-colonial thought that kind of filtered up slowly out of academia, and these came with them. So these all took either years of groundwork, or in the case of social distancing and large language models, a lot of money behind them. For the social distancing by the WHO and government, so for good. For large language models, not necessarily so good. But also, let me reflect on the fact that we felt the need as experimenters to co-opt scientific terms. We wanted to use scientific terms. We decided we needed to use scientific terms. If you remember back to the intervention, we specifically cited our sources, so we had links to where we sourced all our material. And we used, in the case of the planet example, like actual NASA watermarked images. Well, why did we feel to do this? Well, let's imagine like ECAP, the European Conference of Analytic Philosophy, decided knowledge was reliably true belief. How would that go across? You know, ECAP, so like ECAP, it works just like the IAU did, over a course of weeks, or a week, a bunch of committees get together and vote on the resolution and develop the resolution that knowledge is reliably true belief, and then at the end of the conference everyone gets together and votes, and we all vote yes, knowledge is reliably true belief, and then we send the press releases out. How's that going to be written up? It's going to be written up as a joke, right? As like this weird, like, hey look, here's this weird, isn't it kind of weird that philosophers think they can tell us have decided what knowledge is? And that's going to be the end of it. It's not going to go any further than this. We just like as a group, we don't have the social cachet that other groups do. And we're not working in areas that have the same like truthiness, like reality sort of groundedness around it, feeling around it for what we do to be interpreted as like worth, following, and as opposed to like this weird thing that we're off on our own doing. But just to wrap up, I think it's like very simple to study implementation. I'm very pleased with this because like we don't know much about how implementation works in the practical terms. And I think we've kind of just devised a way to do it. If you give them this mass time-like design we use, where we give a group an intervention, which is whatever you think hypothesized content-changing intervention is, whatever you think will change how people talk, whether it's a joke, whether it's like facts, whether it's reasons. And then if you have a measure, you can find their general expressions of conceptual content on a later time. But it's really only if you're willing to adopt specific commitments about what implementation's target is, which is a problem for me, but I don't think a problem for a lot of people in the room, are clear in your mind about implementation success conditions. So what exactly counts as kind of like propagation or uptake in that sense? Is it as opposed to like partial or a group or section of the group, you're clear about what that is and know what to look for, and set aside or resolve potential ethical complications about the power here. I think you can do it, and I would love to talk to people about how to do it. So, lessons learned, theoretical lessons. Literature and conceptual content is unusually messy. Not enough work has been done translating views to behavioral measures. Polysemy is a theoretical lacuna. Polysemy is a mess. Polysemy is a mess?
It is.
It's a mess, okay. It's a mess. I have no idea what to do with it in the context of conceptual engineering. Ethical lessons. The aims of conceptual engineering are very messy in practice. When we actually sit down and implement, I think the aims are very messy and can't be captured by like single sentences and single aims. Implementation can be done transparently, where you're like actually kind of just not trying to subvert their thinking. And implementation may necessarily be political, where you have to push your own views here to kind of implement anything at all. Pragmatic lessons. Philosophers might not have the cachet to philosophers don't have the cachet to propagate concepts. I think the only way it would happen is if it's laundered through other disciplines that have like a closer, more sort of have more cachet, like the humanities or like computer science or something like that. And you can study the propagation of your concept. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ethan. So we're opening the Q&A. Also online, if someone has a question, just either write it on the chat or raise your hand. Well, someone already has a hand. So let's start with Guido.
Hi, thanks so much. Very interesting. Also made a lot of notes. First, I want to say that there's like flying dinosaurs before the extinction event or the meteor or like asteroid event. So there was like already beaks and wings.
Yep.
And so they're not like descendants of dinosaurs. They're literally like the same thing. And the new Jurassic Park has the big like a really feathered dinosaurs at the end.
Hashtag not my Jurassic Park, but yeah. But our dinosaur intervention, I didn't talk about it. The structure of that was to point at exactly this. Be like try to collapse the space between the two, and at least the picture-based intervention where we had these artistic, like sort of recreations of feathered dinosaurs, and a lot of them look very bird-like. We also had shoebills, which look very dinosaur-y, which I don't know if you've ever seen one in person. Yeah.
But that would be probably a case where conceptual engineering, as you call it, like, would be popularized, right? Like the kind of,
Yeah.
okay, but since back to the presentation. So I had this friend, and she was really like suffering from her like social environment, because she was like in this really like posh environment. She felt always inadequate. And I was like, honestly, if you were just with my friends and like, more alternative friends, all of your problems would just vanish. All of you feel so good about yourself, everything would be great. And I feel like it's super applicable here. I feel like your struggles and your worries are because you hang out with the wrong people and you want to impress the Kaplan, Max Deutsch people.
I've given up on that. I get that point. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting how you call like what you call non-standard views of concepts. I feel like they have extremely non-standard views of concepts that nobody has anymore, right? Like, I mean, analytic philosophy is not mainstream. It's super insular. So I'm like, a lot of these issues, I feel like it's just because, well, I think also like the concept literature, it seems like a mess, but it isn't really. It's just because there are all these different commitments like being run together, and same for polysemy. All of these people with like different like theoretical commitments or metaphysical commitments, they come together, talk about polysemy, and they're all talking past each other. So that's why it looks messy, but it's just messy because there's all these people talking about different things. So I feel like, so you're studying essentially how people change their use of words. And yet you constantly want to talk about concepts as if like concept is like a real thing. It's just part of like a theoretical commitment that Max Deutsch and Kaplan have that is totally different from like what a Rothian or like Derrida notion of concept like branding. And that is the mainstream in the humanities. you know, like you seem to make a distinction between philosophy and humanities, but that's because philosophy, as like analytic philosophy, is just so insular and like non-mainstream and just like push itself in this like irrelevant niche. But like actually what you, like all of your allies, all of your friends would probably say, yeah, that's a conceptual inference. Like, yeah, fair enough, you know, like they would, I mean, I would like to draw, I'm not an inferentialist myself, like, so I would like to draw a distinction between sort of inferring, you know, like woman from Bachelor versus H2O from water. Like, you know, kind of there seems to be a distinction between birds or dinosaurs, which is discovery, and Pluto not being a planet, being just a convention. So I feel like there is a distinction there, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not, I mean, I don't think like conceptual content is just inferences because of those reasons, but I don't know, I don't see the issue really.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess I'm a Macherian about concepts out of habit as opposed to like any like reason. Because I think like I do have this sort of like invariantist automatic view just because like that's the water I swim in and that's right. I mean, like I work with psychologists and I asked my colleagues the other day while I was preparing for this, like, what do you think a concept is? And they just sort of shrugged and looked at me like, and
invariantism is this idea that basically nobody shares.
Yeah,
Theodore Maschery in 2009.
And,
like
and
nobody cares about
and
that.
Oregon Fisher in 2020 and all, but most of X5 we asked them. But yeah, no, I get it, and that's sort of I think, but you're totally right about the literature. I think like when I say a mess, what I kind of meant is exactly what you described, which is feel like all these people coming at it with different vocabulary, with different commitments, with different disciplinary norms. It's very hard to work with, and like obviously, I would never like endorse concepts in sort of the Deutsch sense, which is it just means like metaphysical categories.
I don't get it.
I'm full pragmatist now. I never, but yeah, I like broadly agree with you, and I think, but the point was something more like I think those of us working in conceptual engineering need to be a bit clearer about for you what the success conditions are from the point of view. Yeah.
If I could say one last thing, and then like.
Yeah.
I wonder what would happen if you had pitched your paper as, look, I just want people's behavior to change, right? Because the problem was, because you do want to get it published as part of this community of concepts stuff, right? That is the whole issue, right? I mean, I wonder if a reviewer would then say, oh, that is not interesting enough, right? I mean, that would probably also be, one of the reviewers probably said something like that, right? Like, well, it's just linguistic change, but that's not interesting to me, right? So, well, I think if you went fully pragmatist, I think you can have your success conditions maybe. We can talk about this.
Talk about
this. But then they're even more social. But I think there's something like more interesting than just terminological change if you went completely like pragmatist. Cool.
All right, so we have a mix of questions from the room and questions from online. So next question goes to Eve, and then we go on.
I kept trying to like look at you over the monitor.
Yeah. I don't know how to. Okay. So watch out. Okay, so about the question, like when concepts count as revised, when we are dealing with these concepts that have both like a technical, scientific way of using them and like this everyday sense, and the targets, like the people who are supposed to revise our concepts, they are using it like in this scientific sense when like they're asked about like what do scientists believe about this stuff, or like when they consciously reflect on it. But then in everyday life, when you're thinking about like what museum to go to or whatever, then you're still using these everyday concepts. So I think that whether we want in this case to say that the concept has been revised depends on what the aims of the conceptual engineers, in this case the scientists, are in trying to revise people's concepts. So they're not just trying to like make people use that concept like for the hell of it. They're probably doing it because they want people to have like accurate beliefs about the current state of science, or maybe more fundamentally about like the
structure of the reality, like where the joints are, what like species go together, and what heavenly bodies go together. And for that purpose, it's enough if they use these revised concepts in these scientific contexts where these concepts are relevant, because that's when the conceptual engineers get what they wanted out of this revision, that people have like correct beliefs about the current state of the science and the reality underneath it and so on. I guess it would be totally fine for the conceptual engineers, the scientists, if people don't use these concepts also in everyday life, because why would they want that?
Yeah.
That's not part of their purpose. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. I just want to point out when I hosted, so I hosted a Q&A with one of the guys involved in the death of Pluto during the conceptual engineering seminar. He said something really interesting. I agree. I think I agree with you, but he said something really interesting. I think he said it there, where he said basically like, we revise Planet for you. Like we don't care. This is for you. And so like, I don't know if he speaks for everyone, but there was this sense there, which I find very interesting. But I mean, I think you're right with Dinosaur. Like, but he said something very interesting, which is this was meant to be a public-facing revision, and clearly not a very successful one. But I don't know. I think like, but yeah, I think you're right. Where I mean, this is something Kevin Sharp said. I don't know. I've never actually read Fixing Language, but I sat through like 700 seminars of him talking about it. So I don't know if he actually says this in the book, but he was very clear that or sorry, not Replacing Truth, not Fixing Language. I've never actually read Replacing Truth. Sorry, very different. I haven't actually read Replacing Truth. But Kevin Sharp said, I'm really only interested in fixing this for philosophers, which, does he say that in the book?
was working on
Yeah.
Truth Paradox.
Yeah, thank you.
The Meyer Paradox. Yeah.
Yes, so he actually says that in the book. Good. So yeah, in a sense, I've read Replacing Truth. So yeah, I think that's probably worth. Yeah, I think you're right there.
Okay, so the next question is for Simon online.
Thank you very much. I found myself nodding a lot for both of the previous questions. Please forgive any naivety from me. I'm an outsider to conceptual engineering, and I'm a philosophically literate scientist rather than a philosopher. And I want to really, like as a scientist, I want to support this idea. Scientists don't care about words like planet or dinosaur. When we are talking about these things, what's important is the specific technical scientific, like we don't care whether birds are dinosaurs or not. What we care is that there's a common ancestor and there's a line of lineage. Like, so if you ask me whether a chicken is a dinosaur, I will be very, very careful to answer that it depends what you mean by dinosaur, and to spell out that the sense in which a bird is dinosaur is specifically the cladistic sense, right? I'm just repeating some of what I put in the chat. I'm not sure it's even desirable for non-specialists to try and use terms in the way that experts do without the relevant tacit expertise. Scientists are continually annoyed by newspapers oversimplifying scientific findings. And the reason that they're oversimplified in that way is that the scientific image is not the manifest image. But when you're operating in one of them, you have a whole set of kind of tacit kind of assumptions and practices that allow you to make use of technical concepts using words from ordinary language without requiring that those words serve the same purpose in that context that they do for somebody in everyday language. So I strongly disagree that there's clear correct content for the concept of planet or dinosaur. And I think perhaps your empirical results should be interpreted as people can correctly resist an illegitimate appeal to authority regarding their use of a term that is used in a non-technical sense for non-technical reasons. Maybe people can see through that trick, right? And when you introduce the kind of the ethical concerns about conceptual domination, like, okay, you're not pushing for uptake because the content serves your interests in some direct sense, but it seems like you have a kind of buy-in to the idea that there is a universal epistemic good, and you are trying to sell that, you're trying to push that on people. The idea, no, but they should be thinking according to the universally correct way of using a concept. And I, like, for somebody like me, like, that's ethically quite questionable. There is a political agenda there. So yeah, sorry, there wasn't really a question in that, but
no, I like it. I don't know if you can see, but I was like smiling when I thought it was like hit something real true when you're talking about like pushing an illegitimate scientific image on people. I love that. And I think the case for that with dinosaur is very apparent, where we have real reason to hold on to this distinction between holding non-avian dinosaurs as somehow distinct from everyone else. You know, holding the Jurassic Park dinosaurs different from the ones we see around us. And I think that's, like, in retrospect, like, this is like a very old paper and my views have changed a lot. So I think now I'm more inclined to agree with what you're saying than at the time. And I just wanted to tie it into, there's like a similar debate in the 90s in philosophy of language talking about water and like what actually like water is referring to, whether it actually refers to stuff that's like H2O. And one of the problems people would point to about this idea that water is H2O is that something like beer often has more H2O in it than stuff that comes out of a tap. So there's this question of like, why are we calling tap water, which is 98% H2O water, but we're calling beer, which is 99% H2O. Why aren't we calling that water? And one of the views that came out of that is just like, well, it's useful for us to call certain things water, and it's not useful for us to call it beer. It's not useful for us to call beer water, because if we went to the bar and said, hello, I would like a water with trace elements of alcohol and whatever, and carbon dioxide and hops in it, they think you're insane. And so I think, yeah, I would just say, like, I think pragmatic aspects play a big role here on why there's this gap between the scientific image, as you put it, and regular use, is that we really have a reason to resist calling birds dinosaurs, where I think there's maybe less of a reason to resist not calling Pluto a planet. I think there's less kind of hanging on our day-to-day life there. It's just like, do you want to stick with what you were taught when you were growing up and not? But yeah, no, I think like I'm totally willing to take your criticism on board, and I think I agree with broadly with the thrust of it.
yeah, if I may respond, is that okay?
Yeah, as long as it's quick, because we have a lot.
Yeah. So I think that the same arguments apply to whether water is H2O and whether whales are fish. I think the sense in which scientists construe those things is a specific technical sense, and scientists don't care about the use of the words in everyday language.
Yeah, and just my quick rejoinder is we might think that the reason where less people now say Pluto's a planet than before is just scientists care in a way that folk don't, so they kind of just slowly went out in that way. But yeah, I like it. That's very interesting. Very interesting to hear the scientist's perspective. Thank you.
So that's the horrible conclusion. I cannot. Sorry.
Sorry for cutting you off. There's really
You can yell at me
a few more people, and in the
I'm
interest
yelling
of
at
time.
Simon for this.
Apologies. There's a question that I'm going to read out loud from the chat from Anna. Why did you choose to study specifically the examples of revisions of categorical boundaries related to classification in order to study conceptual changes? Was this done deliberately in order to illustrate this type of conceptual engineering? not a change in evaluation or the introduction of new categories, etc. Can we extrapolate these results to other types of conceptual engineering?
Yes, that was on purpose. I've actually forgotten until this moment. I'd forgotten for 2 or 3 years that this was on purpose. The reason we chose to focus on categorization was it was an easy behavioral measure. That we had this clear yes/no signal on whether or not how they applied this concept or how they applied this word. I think with something like valence, it would be much trickier. Like if you want to do emotional valence, it's something I've played around with. Hopefully I have a paper out soon about, where like with valence, the signal's much less clear, or something like the association, sort of like broader associations or what is far less clear. So it was meant mostly as like from our point of view, a practical choice to help us like get a clear behavioral signal to work with. I'm not sure how much it applies, and this is why I wanted, this was really meant to be sort of like, the paper in its earliest form was like, hey, look, we should be doing this sort of research. We should be trying to understand this more to see like, is what we're saying we want to do actually even remotely possible, and what does it look like? You know, we're making all these promises and claims about what can be done. Can these actually happen? And so I guess my answer is like, I don't know how this would apply. I think it's an empirical question what sort of happens with other sorts of conceptual change in terms of content. And I just would like to invite I think this is very much a fruitful ground for empirical work in the future.
Great. In the meantime, so let me just add, Simon was asking if it's possible to
Email him.
continue the Zoom or email him.
I'm writing down your email, Simon.
I guess we can leave, surely I would leave the Zoom connection on, and maybe leave the opportunity to people if they want to interact with people in the chat. But I leave it to people to do whatever they want. We're hanging in a different room for lunch, so it won't be possible to have that water cooler interaction that you, Simon, were mentioning. Okay, so we have 2 more questions. One from Claudia and the other one from Duccio.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about polysemy. I think my question is related to some of the things that people said. So it seems to me that polysemy is going to be present in implementation, that it's something you can't avoid. So whenever you have a change in meaning, there will be a time when one word has 2 different but related meanings. I think that's unavoidable, but I was not sure whether you wanted to see it as a feature of implementation, like this is something we can't avoid, we have to accept, or whether you wanted to say something more positive, like polysemy is a very common phenomenon in natural language. I once read that around 70 or 80% of words in natural languages are polysemous, so it's like a common phenomenon.
Basically all of them.
It's not a problem for communication, really. I mean, there are very few contexts where we are unable to disambiguate. Usually we disambiguate, we are aware of the different meanings, there's no communicative disruption because there's ambiguity. That's the exception. But I was wondering whether this fact that polysemy is not a problem for communication was really helpful or was useful for conceptual engineering, because precisely at least some projects of conceptual engineering, what are saying is that some of our concepts are wrong in a strong sense. And so think, for example, of Haslanger and her definition of a revised definition of woman. So the idea here is that the notion of a woman that we have now, which maybe we can think that it's something striking and natural kind or something like this, like the ordinary notion, I mean, is defective, but it's not only epistemically defective, but also morally defective in some sense, because it contributes to social injustice. And so we need a revised notion. And here one could say that once Haslan introduces the second notion, we get to this situation where the word one is polysemous, and we have two meanings. And perhaps there's no flow of our communication there, and we are aware that we have two meanings, but really the point of the ameliorative project is that one of these two senses is wrong, and we should eliminate it. Like, we don't have to admit this in our conceptual repertoire. So I agree with you that polysemy is just a feature of implementation, but I also think that for some projects it could be a negative feature that we have to face.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like, for the first talk, I think if you're dealing with these, like, terms, you know, terms like woke, which I guess are in a sense are polysemous, where you have, like, the old use, like the old positive use and the new negative use. And those are still kind of floating around. The positive use has almost completely disappeared, but they're still kind of floating around. But, like, if we're kind of thinking about it in, like, the political way, presumably the goal would be to, like, completely remove it as, like, this sort of, if not slur, like, derogatory term. The goal would be completely removed from like, circulation, a slur or something like that. So yeah, I think it's definitely a problem in some and not others. And I guess, in the way I tend to think about it, and in kind of slogan form, is slightly different on whether you're an externalist or an internalist. For an externalist, it's something like baptism is cheap. You know, you can introduce days all. It's the spreading that's sort of the expensive part. Whereas internalists, what I think the kind of the more realistic picture would be something like, what's really possible is addition, not revision. So it's what we're going to get at the end of the day is addition. We're not doing a one-to-one. We're not going to do one-to-one. We're doing one-to-two. And I think that's fine in some projects, yeah. But yeah, but I think I totally agree with you. Like I don't think that like we need to like scream and pull our hair to polysemous. We deal with it all the time. I think analytic philosophy has a very bad track record of dealing with it as a like an intellectual tradition, but yeah, it's like it's part of our life. Let's it's going to be part of this. Let's try to kind of clear up what that's going to look like, what that looks like, and how to talk about that. And that was mainly kind of my point here. But yeah, totally agree.
Okay, I will make a flashpoint. My question was very much similar to Yves' question. I just wanted to make a methodological point that maybe you're interested in for the purposes of XPy. So if we're thinking about implementation in context, and if we take seriously the polysemy claims that we might want to add senses only in certain contexts, then from an experimental perspective, I wonder whether masking is a good practice, because when you mask and you remove the salience, then basically you are removing in some cases you might end up removing the relevant context. So maybe you want to implement a term in a context, maybe the masking is leading you away from this, right? Because the context is relevant.
Yes, and if I were to write the paper that is like Landes and Reuter 2005 is full of crap, what I would point to is that in the multiple choice test we used different masks than we did in the other tasks. In the multiple choice task, I wish we had done this different, but we didn't. In the multiple choice task, we used natural kind concepts, and in the others, we used social kind concepts. And so that might be exactly what's happening right there with that difference. And it's something that, yeah, I think that's very plausible. And so I think like the right way to do this would still to be masked, to still mask it, because you're still interested in has someone changed kind of in this permanent way, but instead of, but like by manipulating context to get the sort of context you want. That would be how I would do it if I would do it again. So yeah.
All right. Shall we go back to your point?
Yeah, everyone said lunch. Right?
Let's go to
Yeah,
lunch.
it's lunchtime.
Let's go to
Yes,
lunch.
I know. Yeah. All right. Okay. So we'll be back in 2 hours. I will leave the session on, even though I will not record. And thanks in the meantime, Ethan, for thanks for everyone in the Q&A and to people online. And we'll resume in 2 hours, so 3 o'clock Madrid time.
But I can talk to Simon though, right?
Yeah, you can talk. Yeah, of course. You can come here and talk to him. Yeah, that's very nice.
Is the lunch tech here?
Yeah, the lunch is here.
Can we leave us here?
Yes, I have the keys. Maybe I can. Well, if he's inside, maybe not.
Maybe we should. Can you hear me?
Oh, it is in the back.
Yes, great job. You can't hear me.
But I think it's safe.
Hi, yes, I can. Sorry,
Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
That's just this one. Well, there's a distinction between changing a tool and then using that tool to find something new, right? So in the case of dinosaur, it would be horrible if we said there wasn't anything interesting for the public to discover. Like that would be a horrible picture of science. You see what I mean? Like you did discover something interesting, and then if you said birds are not dinosaurs, that is just, given the tools we have, not correct.
But so my concern is that's not giving the public the tools that scientists have. What that's doing is that's kind of giving them a kind of a warped and adulterated version of the tools that scientists have. It's not that there's no point in providing the public with with information that comes from science. It's that this sort of rigid idea that there is a correct content to the concept of dinosaur that overlooks the capacity for the public to appreciate that they only partly understand
I know, so
science.
But planet, I completely agree. With planet, it's just, they just changed the definition of planet like a couple of times.
Yeah.
But the dinosaur case is not like that at all. It is like...
Well, it is.
It is, dinosaur is like a very weird category that is totally artificial, right? But given that artificial category, birds are dinosaurs. So every time someone goes outside...
As a scientist, I so strongly disagree with that claim. I think given the specific cladistic definition of dinosaur, if you use dinosaur only in that very, very narrow sense, then yes, birds aren't dinosaurs. But scientists in general will pursue that kind of thought by simply spelling out birds are descended from the same common ancestors as, and they'll give specific examples and all the rest of it. And you won't even need the word dinosaur. You won't be using the concept of dinosaur. You'll be using the concept of cladistic relation to the variety of different organisms, which is not the same as the concept of dinosaur. And there's no particular reason why we should use the word dinosaur to denote that concept.
I mean, I just disagree. As a philosopher of science, I disagree.
Okay.
That's
It's
when people see a pigeon, it is nice for them to think of dinosaurs. Because that is fascinating. That fascinates people about science. And it is true.
Sure, but I think it's fine for it to be fascinating for people to look at birds and to think that that they share a common descent with the things that supposedly went extinct. But the things that went extinct the species that went extinct did go extinct. Pteranodons are extinct. And I don't think that's that fascination. I don't think that kind of joy in understanding new things needs to be tied to the word dinosaur.
That's what dinosaurs are. The birds, like the kind of beak creatures like wings, they existed before the extinction event, right?
They did, but they weren't modern birds. They lacked many of the important features of modern birds.
The most important, the wings, the feathers, the beak.
Why are those most? There are many biologists, ornithologists, who would claim that those are not the most important features of birds for the things that they study scientifically. Why are those the most important? Why are those kind of objectively the most important features of birds?
I'm not even talking objectively, I'm just talking to say, I just feel like, and maybe I don't see the point. I mean, not the point, maybe I don't see your argument.
It feels like you're making a kind of natural kind argument. And I am not a believer in natural kinds, and I don't think that scientists need the idea of natural kind, or even, I would go so far as to say that the idea of natural kind is an active obstacle to scientific progress.
My point is, given a hardcore instrumentalism over science, given anti-natural kinds, given everything, like, given your like very strong instrumentalism, still, birds are dinosaurs. Given all of that, that's just what we mean by dinosaurs. Like, you know,
not what I mean. It's not what I mean by dinosaur, right? We may be talking different dialects of English, but I can tell you for a fact it's not what I mean by dinosaur.
What do you mean by dinosaur?
It depends on the context, but in some contexts, I mean a thing that
looks like T-Rex.
A thing that looks like T-Rex or Deinonychus or...
So that's exactly what I think. Like, people, you know, they have this idea of T-Rex in mind, or like big things, when they just...
It doesn't have to be big, there were small ones as well.
Exactly, right? Like, there were small ones, there were all kinds of... Like, you just, by saying lay people can have their, like, Jurassic Park concept of dinosaurs, you kind of give up on them. You just say, that's why I said it's horrible, because like you kind of give up on them because that's like getting wrong what evolution is. Like that's what gets wrong how impressive.
No, I don't think I'm giving up on them at all, because I don't think I'm giving up on their capacity to do what scientists do, which is to understand the relational scientific concepts that are the things that are really at stake here for science. I'm just saying the word dinosaur, it's just a lexical item, and we can use it to mean all kinds of things, and there are perfectly good reasons to use it to mean things like T-Rex, right? That usage does not commit one to either failing to understand any of the scientific concepts or denying them.
Following your own usage, right? Like you just objected to me when I was saying it's these big things. You said no, there are small things too. There are small things with feathers. There were small things with beaks, and those things went extinct, maybe. You know, and then maybe beaks appear. Who knows? You know, but still, there's this like this line is important, right? Like that pigeons. There is this like ancestry line from the like T-Rex category to pigeons. That is that's what we mean when we say dinosaurs are birds, like birds are dinosaurs.
That's what we mean when we say that birds are dinosaurs, when we are using the word dinosaur in that particular cladistic sense, yes. But that is not the only sense in which we can legitimately use the word dinosaur.
I'm sure we can do all kinds of things. That's the interesting one, right? That is the cool one.
Sorry?
That is the cool one. That is the cool, interesting discovery.
Oh, no. I don't think, I'm not a universalist about that sort of thing. That's cool to you. That's cool and interesting to you and to certain other people, right? Even in regard to whether whales are fish, right? What's cool and interesting in the cladistic sense is not cool and interesting in the ecological sense. Different scientists find different things cool and interesting, and for legitimately different reasons. And the same has to be true for lay people.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's just this case, maybe I'm like particularly passionate about.
Yeah, maybe.
But it was great meeting you. Maybe.
Yeah, likewise.
See you later.
Sorry, I missed your name.
I'm gonna write it down. Guido.
Okay.
Oops, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Press the wrong button. Aktuell 19 doesn't somehow like I can send it to you. Yeah, just
Okay.
yeah. I'll have lunch now. It's great.
Yeah, no, enjoy your lunch.
Like super interesting. Also, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's interesting to hear a scientist's perspective.
A scientist's perspective, yeah.
I mean, I also think. No, okay, leave it to you. I see.
No. Yeah.